Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps in 218 BCE and immediately forced Rome into a war it had not prepared to fight on its own soil. He won spectacular battles in Italy, yet Carthage still lost the Second Punic War. So why did a campaign that began with the most unthinkable maneuver of the ancient world end without the decisive political collapse it was designed to trigger? Why would a commander deliberately grind down his own army before the first major engagement, through cold, cliffs, hunger, and mutiny risk, when every normal doctrine says you can serve strength first? And why did Rome, a state built on disciplined procedure, fail to stop him at the moment when stopping him should have been easiest? This is not a story about bravery. It is an investigation into a strategy built on one fragile assumption, and the price paid when that assumption refuses to behave. The strategic problem is brutally simple. Hannibal could not defeat Rome the way Rome expected to be defeated. Carthage did not have Rome's manpower depth. It did not have Rome's political redundancy. It did not have the luxury of a long, conventional contest where losses could be replaced and failure could be explained away. So Hannibal needed something else. Not a better battlefield trick, but a systemic shock, an action that would break Rome's decision-making rhythm, fracture its alliance network in Italy, and force political outcomes faster than Rome's manpower machine could adapt. Crossing the Alps was unusual because it weaponized self-inflicted risk. It turned logistics into a countdown, morale into a restraint mechanism, and geography into an attack on enemy cognition. The move only makes sense if you accept one hidden premise, that Rome would react like a rational, bounded institution, slow to believe the impossible, and slower to reconfigure itself once surprised. But what if that premise was wrong? What if Rome's true strength was not its armies, but its capacity to absorb strategic humiliation and keep functioning? Because the Alps were not the battle. They were the moment Hannibal bet his entire war on how Rome thinks. Before Hannibal crossed the Alps, the war between Carthage and Rome was not supposed to be fought in Italy. Rome expected a familiar pattern. Pressure on Carthaginian holdings in Spain. Naval containment. Gradual strangulation through superior manpower and logistics. A war of systems, not surprises. Hannibal understood this. And he understood something deeper. If the war followed Rome's preferred geometry, Carthage would lose by default. Not because Rome was smarter on the battlefield, but because Rome was structurally designed to survive losses that Carthage could not. So the real map of this war is not geographic. It is institutional. Rome's strategic strength rested on three pillars. First, manpower depth. Losses were painful but survivable. Second, alliance cohesion. Italian city-states paid the price of obedience, but they were bound by fear and habit. Third, procedural command. Decisions were slow, sometimes clumsy, but resilient. Hannibal could not destroy these pillars directly. He did not have siege capacity to take Rome itself. He did not have reinforcements flowing steadily from Africa. And he did not have the political capital to wait. What he did have was time, briefly, and the ability to create shock. The situation Hannibal faced before the Alpine crossing was constrained on every axis. Geographically, the obvious routes into Italy were guarded or monitored. Rome's fleets controlled much of the western Mediterranean. Marching through southern Gaul and into Italy via the coast would have been expected, tracked, and countered. Logistically, Hannibal's army was already operating at the edge of sustainability. It was multinational, culturally fragmented, and dependent on momentum. Prolonged stalling would mean internal decay. Politically, Carthage was divided. Hannibal did not enjoy unlimited backing from the home government. His campaign was tolerated, not fully resourced. Every month without decisive progress weakened his position. Time was the most brutal constraint. Rome could afford delay. Hannibal could not. Now consider Rome's perspective. From Rome's strategic worldview, an Alpine crossing at scale violated probability. The Alps were not merely mountains. They were a barrier of assumptions, weather unpredictability, impassable passes, hostile tribes, and logistical impossibility. Rome had crossed them before in limited ways, but never imagined an enemy army deliberately doing so as an offensive entry point. This created a cognitive blind spot. Rome did not station major forces to block the Alps because doing so would have seemed irrational. It would mean diverting troops based on a threat that contradicted precedent. In a system built on procedural justification, that kind of move required evidence. Evidence did not exist until Hannibal appeared. This is where the asymmetry begins. Hannibal's objective was not to defeat Rome in a single battle. It was to fracture Rome's political ecosystem. To convince Rome's allies that the Republic could not protect them. To make neutrality, or defection, seem rational. Italy was not a unified nation-state. It was a web of obligations held together by Rome's aura of inevitability. Break that aura, and the web loosens. But this objective carried a paradox. To persuade Italian allies to defect, Hannibal needed to appear unstoppable. To appear unstoppable, he needed victories. To win victories, he needed a functional army. To keep the army functional, he needed supplies, morale, and cohesion. Crossing the Alps directly attacked this chain. Every soldier lost to exposure weakened the very image Hannibal needed to project. Every delay increased the chance that Rome would recover from surprise. Every logistical failure reduced his leverage over potential allies. This is the core tension of the campaign. The move designed to shock Rome also threatened to neutralize Hannibal's own political signal. The Alps magnified every weakness. Terrain forced the army into narrow, vulnerable columns. Weather destroyed equipment and animals. Local hostility turned resupply into conflict. Discipline was strained under conditions where authority feels abstract and survival feels personal. Hannibal was not just managing an advance. He was managing a psychological experiment under lethal conditions. And yet, the alternative paths were worse. A conventional approach would have delivered Hannibal into northern Italy late, depleted, and expected. Rome would have had time to concentrate forces, choose favorable ground, and frame the conflict as another foreign incursion to be methodically eliminated. Surprise was not optional. It was the only currency Hannibal could afford. From Rome's side, the early signals were ambiguous. Reports filtered in slowly. Rumors contradicted each other. An enemy army in Gaul was not new. An enemy army crossing the Alps in force was dismissed as exaggeration. This delay mattered. By the time Roman command structures accepted the reality of Hannibal's position, the strategic geometry had shifted. Defensive preparations were reactive rather than anticipatory. Decision-makers were forced to respond to events already unfolding, rather than shape them. This does not mean Rome panicked. It means Rome lost initiative at a critical moment. The map at this stage is not one of armies moving toward each other. It is a map of clocks. Hannibal's clock was counting down to collapse, of morale, of logistics, of internal cohesion. Rome's clock was counting up toward mobilization, adaptation, and institutional learning. The Alps were the point where these clocks intersected. If Hannibal could force decisive engagements before Rome recalibrated, the political shock might cascade. If Rome could absorb the initial disruption without systemic failure, the Alpine gamble would retroactively become a liability. This is why the crossing matters. Not because it was daring, but because it was a forced compression of time. Hannibal tried to shorten the war to a window where Rome's strengths could not fully activate. Rome tried to stretch the conflict until Hannibal's constraints consumed him. Everything that follows, battles, defections, victories, and eventual stalemate, flows from this temporal collision. And inside this pressure cooker, one question becomes unavoidable. If conventional doctrine would fail Hannibal anyway, what exactly did normal strategy look like, and why was it insufficient? If Hannibal had followed doctrine, the war would have been lost before it truly began. Ancient military logic was not reckless. It was conservative for a reason. Armies were fragile systems. They depended on cohesion, supply, and predictable movement. A commander's first obligation was not to surprise, but to preserve the force long enough to decide the war. From this perspective, the correct options were obvious. Advance through familiar routes. Secure supply lines. Maintain proximity to friendly territory. Force the enemy into battle on chosen ground. Avoid terrain that multiplies uncertainty. No classical manual would recommend dragging a multinational army through high mountains controlled by hostile tribes, with no secure rear, no resupply base, and no margin for delay. This is why the Alpine crossing appears irrational when viewed through doctrinal lenses. A normal commander would have aimed for incremental advantage. Pressure Roman allies diplomatically. Fight limited engagements. Avoid catastrophic attrition. Keep retreat viable. But doctrine assumes something Hannibal could not afford: time. Conventional strategy works best when both sides operate within the same rhythm. When wars are decided by accumulation of victories, territory, or attrition. Rome was built for that rhythm. Carthage was not. If Hannibal advanced conventionally, Rome would not need brilliance to win. It would only need patience. This is the first doctrinal failure. Standard doctrine treats surprise as a force multiplier, not as the foundation of strategy. Hannibal inverted this. Surprise was not an accessory, it was the only way to level a structural imbalance. A second doctrinal assumption was equally limiting, that decisive outcomes come from decisive battles. Rome expected this. Concentrate legions. Absorb losses. Learn. Repeat. Eventually, the opponent breaks. But Hannibal's problem was not Rome's army. It was Rome's system. Even catastrophic Roman battlefield losses could be politically absorbed. Rome had consuls, senates, allies, and replacement armies. Victory on the field did not guarantee victory in the war. So doctrine's focus on battle outcomes was insufficient. Hannibal needed something else: a political cascade. The third doctrinal constraint was logistical orthodoxy. Ancient armies lived and died by supply. Secure lines meant survival. Broken lines meant collapse. Doctrine teaches that logistics must precede ambition. Hannibal reversed the sequence. He treated logistics as something to be generated through movement, victory, and intimidation. This was not ignorance. It was necessity. Remaining close to Carthaginian supply networks would keep him predictable and slow. Moving deep into Italy would force the war to feed itself, or end quickly. This is where doctrine offered no safe answers. Every correct option converged on strategic defeat. Hannibal's situation created a paradox: following the rules guaranteed failure, but breaking them risked annihilation. Doctrine also underestimates psychology. Most military thinking assumes rational opponents responding to visible threats. Hannibal bet against that assumption. He believed Rome's institutions would hesitate when confronted with something that violated expectation. This was not about trickery. It was about institutional inertia. A senate does not move at the speed of an individual commander. It debates. It seeks precedent. It demands confirmation. Hannibal aimed to exploit this lag. Doctrine cannot easily account for disbelief. There is also the question of command legitimacy. Normal strategy preserves optionality. It allows commanders to justify decisions upward. To explain losses as unfortunate but reasonable. The Alpine crossing destroyed that safety net. Once Hannibal committed, there was no plausible narrative of prudence. Success would appear miraculous. Failure would appear insane. This mattered internally. Officers, subcommanders, allied contingents, none were obligated to trust a plan that seemed to court disaster. Hannibal's authority had to be absolute, not procedural. Doctrine rarely addresses this dimension: how far a commander can deviate before obedience fractures. Hannibal crossed that line deliberately. He replaced institutional legitimacy with personal authority. The army followed him not because the plan made sense on paper, but because retreat made even less sense. In this way, the Alps functioned as an enforcement mechanism. By choosing a path with no fallback, Hannibal eliminated dissent as a practical option. Doubt could exist, but it could not become action. This is profoundly unorthodox. Most doctrine assumes discipline is maintained through structure. Hannibal maintained it through entrapment. But this choice created a final doctrinal contradiction. Doctrine seeks to minimize variance. Hannibal maximized it. Weather, terrain, tribal politics, human endurance. Each introduced volatility. The campaign's outcome depended on variables outside any commander's full control. This is why many historians oscillate between calling Hannibal a genius and calling him reckless. Both labels miss the point. The Alpine crossing was not a solution. It was a forced reconfiguration of the war's logic. Hannibal was not choosing between good and bad options. He was choosing between slow defeat and immediate existential risk. Doctrine had no answer for that dilemma. Which raises the question that matters most for this campaign. If standard strategy could not work, An unorthodox strategy might destroy the army before it reached Italy. How did such a decision even become thinkable? Who argued for it? Who resisted it? And what assumptions had to be accepted before Hannibal committed his entire war to one irreversible move? Because the Alps were not crossed on impulse. They were crossed after a decision-making process that deliberately embraced catastrophe as a tool. This decision did not emerge from bravado. It emerged from constraint. Hannibal did not wake up and choose the Alps because he wanted to shock history. He arrived at the Alps because every other path collapsed under scrutiny. Inside his command structure, the problem was clear long before the march began. A conventional invasion of Italy required naval security. Carthage did not have it. A slow advance through southern Gaul would expose the army to Roman interception. A defensive posture in Spain would concede initiative and time. None of these options solved the central dilemma: Rome's system would outlast him. The Alpine route appeared not as a plan, but as an anomaly. A space on the map where Roman expectations thinned out. That alone was not enough to justify it. The internal resistance was real. Senior officers understood the risks. Allied contingents had no historical loyalty to such a maneuver. The logistical objections were obvious. Loss rates would be high. Animals would die. Equipment would be abandoned. Units would fragment. But the counterargument was sharper. Any plan that preserved the army but preserved Rome's strategic comfort was not a plan, it was surrender deferred. This is the first assumption Hannibal had to accept, that attrition before contact was preferable to predictability before contact. It is a deeply uncomfortable assumption for any commander. The second assumption cut deeper. Hannibal believed that Roman decision-making was slower than Roman mobilization. That Rome could raise armies faster than it could reframe the war. That its institutional confidence would delay extreme responses. This was not a guess about Roman courage. It was a judgment about Roman bureaucracy. If Rome needed confirmation, debate, and procedural alignment before acting decisively, then a move that violated precedent could buy Hannibal something more valuable than troops: time inside Italy. The third assumption was the most dangerous. Hannibal assumed that psychological momentum could substitute for material depth. The Alpine crossing would not just surprise Rome. It would bind Hannibal's own army into a shared narrative of survival. Those who reached Italy would believe they had already endured the worst. Retreat would feel meaningless. Victory would feel necessary. This is not morale in the sentimental sense. It is morale as compulsion. Once the army committed to the mountains, descent lost its utility. You could doubt the plan, but you could not escape it. Every step forward made retreat less rational. Hannibal turned geography into an internal control mechanism. This assumption was never guaranteed to work. A smaller army under extreme stress can harden, or it can fracture. Hunger does not inspire loyalty by default. Fear does not automatically translate into discipline. This is where Hannibal's personal authority became decisive. He did not present the crossing as an option. He framed it as a condition of survival. The army would either endure together or disintegrate separately. There was no procedural legitimacy left. Only outcome legitimacy. That is a fragile foundation. At this point, the strategy stops being about Rome and becomes about internal management. Hannibal had to maintain coherence without supply certainty. Order without comfort. Obedience without reassurance. Every delay increased the probability of collapse. This is why the plan targeted multiple domains at once. It was not only an attack on Roman expectations. It was an attack on time, on geography, on psychology, and on the internal politics of his own force. The Alps were not a route. They were a filter. Those who could not endure would be removed by circumstance. Those who remained would be transformed by it. This filtering effect is rarely discussed. It is also ethically brutal. The army that emerged into Italy was smaller, harder, and more dependent on Hannibal's judgment. But it was also less replaceable. Every loss now mattered more. Hannibal accepted this trade knowingly. This is what makes the decision unorthodox in its purest sense. It was not optimized for success. It was optimized for necessity. There is also an often missed political layer. By committing to the Alps, Hannibal signaled to Carthage that the war would be decided far from home. Reinforcement would be difficult. Oversight would be minimal. Success or failure would be his alone. This insulated him from interference, but also from rescue. The strategy assumed that Rome's allies in Italy would respond to proof of vulnerability. That they would calculate self-interest faster than loyalty. But Hannibal could not test this assumption until after the crossing. The entire plan required the crossing to succeed before its core logic could even be evaluated. This is the final paradox. The decision that defined the war could not be validated until after it had irreversibly reshaped the war. Once Hannibal stepped onto the Alpine paths, there was no remaining strategic debate. Only execution under pressure. And execution would determine whether this was remembered as calculated audacity, or as strategic self-destruction. Because once the decision was made, the Alps stopped being a question, and became a countdown. Once the march began, the strategy stopped being theoretical. There was no buffer between decision and consequence. Every hour in the mountains translated directly into attrition. Not abstract attrition, but bodies lost, animals collapsing, weapons discarded to stay alive. This is the moment where unorthodox strategy faces its most dangerous test. Reality does not care about intent. The Alpine terrain immediately stripped Hannibal of control in conventional terms. Columns stretched. Units lost visual contact. Orders traveled slowly, if at all. Terrain dictated movement more than command did. Doctrine assumes a commander shapes the battlefield. Here, the battlefield shaped the commander. Weather was not an inconvenience. It was a variable that erased planning. Cold destroyed morale silently. Snow erased paths. Rockslides did not announce themselves. A single misjudged slope could eliminate a unit without combat. Hannibal could not fight these threats. He could only endure them. Logistics collapsed into improvisation. Pack animals died first. When they fell, food fell with them. Heavy equipment was abandoned. Siege tools became liabilities. What remained was what soldiers could carry and what could be seized. This was not sustainable supply. It was survival extraction. Every delay worsened the equation. The longer the army stayed in the mountains, the less capable it would be when it emerged. Speed became the only form of defense. But speed increased risk. This is the execution trap: move fast and lose cohesion, or move slow and lose men. At several points, the march nearly failed outright. Hostile tribes attacked from terrain where conventional formations were useless. Panic spread faster than commands. Soldiers questioned whether dissent even existed on the other side. Hannibal's response was not tactical brilliance. It was psychological containment. He moved constantly. He appeared where morale was weakest. He made retreat physically difficult and mentally absurd. Turning back meant recrossing what had already nearly killed them. In this sense, the Alps enforced obedience better than any officer could. The first micro-twist came from miscalculation. Routes believed passable narrowed into lethal choke points. Units stalled. Supplies ran out faster than expected. The plan had assumed hardship. It had not fully anticipated cumulative exhaustion. This is critical. The strategy relied on the army emerging into Italy functional enough to fight immediately. Every additional loss threatened that requirement. Here is the second micro-twist. The march filtered the army, but not cleanly. It did not only remove the weak. It removed specialists. Cavalry suffered disproportionately. Logistics capacity shrank faster than infantry numbers suggested. The army that descended was hardened, but unbalanced. This matters because Hannibal's later victories relied heavily on combined arms coordination. What survived the Alps was not an optimized force. It was a damaged one. The risk here is often underplayed. If Rome had forced a battle immediately upon Hannibal's descent, the Carthaginian army might not have been ready. Fatigue does not disappear when terrain ends. Hannibal was gambling that Rome would need time to process what had happened. That gamble worked, but only narrowly. Execution also revealed a deeper flaw. The strategy assumed that hardship would unify the army under Hannibal's authority. In reality, hardship amplifies existing fractures. Ethnic divisions sharpened. Blame circulated. Trust eroded under hunger. Hannibal had to suppress internal breakdown while marching forward without pause. This is not operational detail. This is strategic risk. An army that fractures internally does not need an enemy to be defeated. At multiple points, Hannibal chose routes that sacrificed safety for speed. This was not recklessness. It was arithmetic. Every day saved reduced the probability of Roman interception. Every life lost reduced combat capacity. Hannibal consistently chose to save days. This tells us something essential about the strategy. The objective was never to preserve the army at maximum strength. The objective was to preserve the war at maximum intensity. Once the Alps were entered, the strategy shifted from reach Italy to reach Italy before Rome believes you can. This distinction is subtle but decisive. The Alps were not crossed successfully because losses were acceptable. They were crossed because losses were priced into the plan from the start. That pricing was brutal and precise. By the time Hannibal descended into northern Italy, the army was reduced, exhausted, and operationally fragile. But it carried something Rome did not expect: momentum. Survival itself became proof. The very fact that Hannibal stood in Italy reframed the war. Rome's mental map was obsolete. But this was the narrowest margin imaginable. Had weather delayed the descent? Had tribal resistance been more coordinated? Had internal cohesion snapped at the wrong moment? The strategy would not have failed. It would have imploded. This is the truth execution exposes. The Alpine crossing did not demonstrate control. It demonstrated tolerance for loss. Hannibal accepted a level of internal damage that most commanders would consider disqualifying. He did so because the alternative was strategic irrelevance. The army that emerged was not victorious. It was committed. And that commitment forced Rome to respond, not on its own terms, but under the pressure of disbelief. Because once Hannibal reached Italy alive, the question was no longer whether the plan was dangerous, only whether Rome would understand what kind of danger it faced. Rome did not fail to react because it was weak. Rome failed to react correctly because it misunderstood what it was seeing. When reports confirmed that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, the immediate Roman response was disbelief turning into urgency, but not clarity. The Republic had prepared for invasion. What it had not prepared for was inversion. From Rome's doctrinal viewpoint, an army that had just crossed the Alps should be vulnerable, reduced, disorganized, in need of recovery time. Logic dictated that such a force would avoid confrontation until rebuilt. So Rome acted on a reasonable assumption. It sought to contain, to observe, to position forces defensively while gathering information, to wait for the enemy to reveal weakness. This was the first misread. Hannibal did not need time to recover. He needed Rome to hesitate. Rome interpreted Hannibal's presence as the aftermath of an ordeal. Hannibal intended it to be read as proof of inevitability. That distinction mattered. Roman command structures were not unified in interpretation. Some commanders argued for immediate engagement. Others urged caution. Political considerations shaped military pacing. No single authority could impose a radical response quickly. This institutional friction was not incompetence. It was the normal cost of a republic at war. Hannibal exploited it. By moving rapidly and aggressively after descent, he denied Rome the recovery narrative it expected. Engagements occurred before Rome's cognitive model had stabilized. Rome expected consolidation. Hannibal delivered acceleration. The second misread was psychological. Roman leaders assumed that an army under extreme hardship would be cautious. That fatigue would translate into risk aversion. That morale would be brittle. Instead, Hannibal's army behaved as if retreat were impossible, which it was. This inverted Roman expectations. Roman commanders prepared for a cautious enemy and faced an aggressive one. Their early deployments reflected this mismatch. The third misread was political. Rome underestimated the signaling effect of Hannibal's survival. The mere fact of his presence in Italy, after an impossible march, did not just threaten Roman armies. It sent a message to Rome's allies. Rome assumed loyalty would hold unless explicitly challenged. Hannibal understood that loyalty erodes when inevitability dissolves. Every Roman delay, every defensive posture, Every hesitation reinforced the impression that Rome was reacting rather than controlling. This was the true strategic damage. Hannibal did not need allies to defect immediately. He needed them to reconsider. Rome's alliance system was built on confidence, not affection. Once confidence wavered, Rome had to fight politically as well as militarily. Here, Rome's doctrinal rigidity became visible. Roman strategy prioritized defeating enemy armies. Hannibal targeted the environment those armies depended on. Even when Rome began to adapt tactically, the strategic lag persisted. Adjustments were reactive. Responses addressed battles, not the underlying disruption. This is where Rome's strength became a temporary weakness. Its ability to absorb loss encouraged patience. Patience delayed recalibration. Rome believed time favored it. Hannibal believed time would kill him. This asymmetry shaped every interaction. Even Rome's correct decisions were often mistimed. Forces were raised, but not concentrated fast enough. Strategies were debated, but not imposed decisively. Hannibal did not need Rome to collapse. He needed Rome to move at its normal speed. And Rome did. Only later, after repeated shocks, did Rome begin to reframe the war. To abandon expectation of decisive confrontation. To adapt strategically rather than procedurally. By then, the window Hannibal needed had begun to close. This is the irony. Rome's initial misreading allowed Hannibal to win battles. Rome's eventual correction ensured Hannibal would not win the war. But that outcome was not visible at this stage. At this moment, the Alpine gamble appeared justified. Rome had been surprised, unsettled, and forced into reaction. Yet beneath this apparent success, the costs were accumulating. Hannibal's army was irreplaceable. Rome's was not. Rome could afford to be wrong and learn. Hannibal could not afford to be wrong twice. This asymmetry would soon dominate the conflict. Because Rome's first mistake was disbelief, but its greatest weapon was endurance. And endurance does not reveal itself in the opening acts of a war. By any conventional measure, Hannibal's strategy worked. He survived the Alps. He forced Rome into Italy on his terms. He won battles that should have broken any normal enemy's will to fight. Roman armies were destroyed. Commanders were disgraced. Fear moved faster than legions. And yet, the war did not end. This is the central discomfort of the Alpine strategy. Tactical success arrived on schedule. Strategic collapse did not. The immediate outcome was exactly what Hannibal needed in the short term. Rome lost control of tempo. Italian allies hesitated. Some defected. Rome's aura of inevitability cracked. But cracks are not collapses. The victories Hannibal achieved after the crossing amplified the shock, but they did not resolve the underlying asymmetry. Rome could lose armies and remain Rome. Hannibal could not lose momentum and remain dangerous. This is where the cost of the Alpine gamble becomes visible. The first cost was irreversibility. By choosing the Alps, Hannibal committed to a war fought entirely on enemy soil with no secure rear and no reliable reinforcement. Every loss after the crossing was permanent. Every veteran killed reduced future options. Rome, by contrast, treated losses as transactions. Painful, but manageable. The second cost was strategic narrowing. Hannibal's victories gave him freedom of movement, but not freedom of outcome. He could maneuver, ambush, and devastate. What he could not do was force Rome into a political settlement. The Alpine strategy assumed that enough shock would fracture Rome's alliance system decisively. That assumption proved only partially true. Some allies defected. Many did not. Rome adapted. Not quickly. Not elegantly. But relentlessly. This is the cost Hannibal could not pay: time. The longer the war continued, the more Rome's systemic advantages reasserted themselves. New armies. New commanders. New doctrines. Rome learned without needing to win immediately. Hannibal had already paid the highest entry fee possible just to be present in Italy. He had no equivalent reserve to draw from. The third cost was psychological attrition on the commander himself. Hannibal had designed a strategy that required constant pressure. Constant success. Constant belief. Every failure, every delay, every non-decision eroded not just the army's strength, but the logic of the campaign. This creates a unique burden. A conventional commander can absorb setbacks and regroup. Hannibal's strategy did not allow for stagnation. If the war stopped moving forward, it began moving backward. The Alps had created a one-directional logic. The fourth cost was political isolation. Carthage did not fully match Hannibal's commitment. Resources were limited. Support was inconsistent. The strategy had placed the entire war's outcome on one commander's operational brilliance far from home. This was empowerment and abandonment. Rome, by contrast, mobilized as a collective system. When commanders failed, others replaced them. When strategies failed, doctrine evolved. Hannibal was irreplaceable. That made him powerful. It also made him fragile. This leads to the most uncomfortable question. Was the Alpine strategy flawed, or was it the only strategy capable of producing any chance at all? If Hannibal had chosen a safer path, the war would have been lost quietly. No shock. No defections. No crisis in Rome's confidence. The Alps bought Hannibal a window. But the price of that window was everything else. This reframes how we judge the outcome. The strategy did not fail because it was reckless. It failed because its success conditions were too narrow. It required Rome to behave like a brittle system. Rome was not brittle. It was elastic. Rome absorbed humiliation and adapted. It restructured command. It avoided decisive battles. It learned to deny Hannibal the political payoff his victories required. The Alpine strategy forced Rome to evolve. That evolution, ironically, is what defeated Hannibal. The final cost was historical. By crossing the Alps, Hannibal ensured his campaign would be remembered as extraordinary. But he also ensured that failure would be read as overreach rather than constraint. History remembers daring. It struggles to remember necessity. The truth is less flattering and more instructive. Hannibal did not lose because the Alpine strategy was irrational. He lost because it could not be repeated, reinforced, or scaled. It was a single-use weapon. Once Rome survived the shock, the weapon was spent. This is not tragedy in the emotional sense. It is tragedy in the structural sense. A strategy that must succeed quickly or not at all is always at war with time. And time is the one adversary that never panics. Which leaves us with the final question: if the Alpine crossing was neither madness nor triumph, what does it actually teach us about unorthodox strategy itself? The Alpine crossing is often remembered as a feat of endurance or audacity. Both interpretations are incomplete. What Hannibal executed was not an act of bravery, and not a tactical trick. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite the logic of the war by attacking the assumptions that structured Rome's power. The mountains were not the objective. They were the mechanism through which Hannibal forced the conflict into a form Rome had not optimized itself to handle. At its core, this strategy was about collapsing distance between expectation and reality, between political confidence and military vulnerability, between Rome's belief in control and the sudden realization that control had limits. Hannibal understood that Rome's strength did not come from flawless decision-making, but from its ability to absorb failure inside a stable system. So he did not try to beat Rome at its own pace. He tried to compress time so violently that Rome's system would be forced to make decisions before it was ready. This is the first principle the Alpine campaign reveals: unorthodox strategy does not aim to be clever, it aims to be destabilizing. Hannibal was not searching for advantage in terrain alone. He was searching for advantage in cognition. He chose a path that Rome had dismissed not because it was optimal, but because it was cognitively discounted. The value of the Alps lay in disbelief. A threat that is not believed does not trigger proportional defenses. Hannibal weaponized that delay. The second principle is more uncomfortable. Unorthodox strategies often rely on self-inflicted damage as a feature, not a bug. Hannibal accepted losses not because he underestimated them, but because he calculated that certain kinds of loss could be traded for initiative. The march destroyed manpower, animals, equipment, and margin for error. But it also destroyed dissent, optionality, and hesitation. By eliminating retreat as a viable choice, Hannibal reshaped the behavior of his own organization. The army that emerged into Italy was not simply smaller. It was psychologically locked into forward motion. This reveals something doctrine rarely admits. Discipline does not always come from structure. Sometimes it comes from entrapment. When survival depends on collective success, individual risk tolerance changes. Hannibal exploited this. He did not motivate his army with promises of victory. He motivated it by making any alternative worse. The third principle concerns asymmetry of endurance. Hannibal's strategy assumed that Rome's political system would fracture under repeated shock. That assumption was partially correct, but fatally incomplete. Rome did fracture at the edges. Allies hesitated. Confidence wavered. Commanders argued. But Rome's system was not designed to collapse under pressure. It was designed to stretch. Losses did not delegitimize it. Delay did not paralyze it. Even humiliation could be absorbed as long as the institutional core remained intact. Hannibal misjudged this elasticity. He correctly identified Rome's blind spot at the beginning of the war, but he overestimated how long that blind spot would persist. The Alpine strategy was front-loaded. It produced maximum effect early and diminishing returns thereafter. Once Rome recalibrated, once it stopped trying to win quickly and started trying to survive longer than Hannibal, the logic of the campaign inverted. This leads to the fourth principle: unorthodox strategies are often non-renewable. They create advantage by violating expectation, but expectation adapts. Hannibal crossed the Alps once. He could not do it again. He could not replicate the shock at the same scale. Every subsequent action occurred in a strategic environment that had already been altered by his first move. The very success of the Alpine crossing ensured it could never be repeated. Rome, by contrast, learned. Slowly, painfully, but permanently. It adjusted command structures, avoided decisive engagements, and shifted the war into a form that neutralized Hannibal's strengths. Once that adaptation occurred, the Alpine gamble lost its leverage. Hannibal was still dangerous, but no longer transformative. The fifth and final principle is the most difficult to accept. Unorthodox strategy often conflates necessity with genius. Hannibal's decision was brilliant not because it was optimal, but because it was the only move that preserved any chance of success. That distinction matters. A strategy born of constraint should not be judged by whether it delivers total victory, but by whether it meaningfully alters the outcome space. Hannibal did that. He forced Rome into a war it did not want, at a time and place it did not choose, under conditions it did not control. What he could not do was finish the transformation he began. The Alps bought him entry into Italy, shock against Roman confidence, and a series of tactical victories. They did not buy him replacement armies, political unity at home, or the ability to outlast a system designed for attrition. The Alpine crossing therefore stands as a warning as much as a lesson. It shows how far strategic creativity can go when orthodox paths guarantee failure. But it also shows the ceiling of such creativity when it is unsupported by structural depth. Hannibal broke Rome's expectations. Rome broke Hannibal by refusing to break. Unorthodox strategies are not shortcuts to victory. They are accelerants. They intensify outcomes, for better or worse. They compress timelines, magnify errors, and punish incorrect assumptions brutally. Hannibal's campaign demonstrates that when such a strategy works, it works immediately. When it does not, there is no graceful recovery. In the end, the Alps did not decide the war. They decided the terms under which the war would be fought. Hannibal chose those terms because the default terms favored Rome absolutely. That choice was rational. It was necessary. And it was insufficient. Because strategy can force an enemy to react differently. It cannot force an enemy to stop adapting. Hannibal did not cross the Alps to win battles. He crossed them to break a system. What followed proves how difficult that task truly is. The campaign shows us that unorthodox strategy is not about brilliance in isolation. It is about diagnosing where an opponent's strength becomes inertia, and then applying pressure faster than adaptation can occur. Hannibal succeeded at that, briefly. Rome stumbled, hesitated, and suffered losses it never expected to endure. But the campaign also shows that systems designed for endurance do not collapse easily. Rome survived not because it was smarter in the opening moves, but because it refused to let early disaster dictate final outcomes. It learned, slowed the war down, and turned time into a weapon. Hannibal's mistake was not crossing the Alps. His mistake was believing that the shock would be decisive rather than catalytic. He underestimated Rome's capacity to metabolize fear, loss, and humiliation without surrendering political coherence. That is the lasting lesson. Unorthodox strategies are most powerful against rigid opponents. They are far less effective against systems that can absorb shock and evolve. The Alps cracked Rome's confidence. They did not destroy Rome's resilience. In the end, Hannibal forced Rome to become something stronger than it had been before. That transformation ensured his defeat. And that is the cold truth behind one of history's most famous marches: the boldest strategies do not fail because they are too daring. They fail because they reveal, too late, that the enemy's real strength lies not where you expected it to break,